So good afternoon. My name is Julie Cusick and I am the engagement coordinator for Alberta Capital Airshed and West Central Airshed. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land from which you join us today. All right, so with that, welcome. This is the 5th of our Clean Air webinar series, but it is the first hybrid webinar in this series that we are doing. So today it's going to be a little bit different. We have our panelists joining us in person as well as a small in-person audience with our board members from Alberta Capital Airshed. So if you would like to view any of our previous webinars, you can head to Alberta Capital capitalairshed.ca or www.wcas.ca. Today we are talking about climate change and its relationship to air quality. To help us explore this relationship better, we have our 3 guests. We have David Dodge, give a little wave, from Green Energy Futures. We have Andrew Reed from the City of Edmonton, give a little wave, great. And Gary Redmond from both West Central Airshed and Alberta Capital Airshed. So how the hour will go is each panelist will give their presentation and you may have comments or questions. We'll get to how you do that in just a moment. If you are joining online, please use the comment box for any extra comments or tidbits that you want to share with the crowd. That's totally okay. We know you're a respectful crowd, just type it all out there. If you have a question for our panelists during the Q&A period, use the Q&A section on the Zoom bar there. If you are somebody joining us in person, you have 2 options. You can either raise your hand when it's Q&A time and we'll do a live that way, or you can text me, which my phone number is right there on the board, and I can do it that way. Finally, there are no bad questions. Today we have attendees joining us from municipalities, academics, people in the Alberta government, regular community members, as well as people from the industry. So with that, I would also like to give you a heads up that we have a special surprise today. We will be announcing this award recipients for the 2nd annual Alberta Capital Airshed Clean Air Awards. So with that, let's get started. Gary Redmond, maybe clap or something, make sure that the owl can see you. Okay, is the executive director of both the Alberta Capital Airshed and West Central Airshed Society, where he provides leadership in air quality management within Alberta, with a background in emergency and environmental management spanning over 25 years. Gary has held senior positions within government, industry, and NGO sectors in Canada and abroad. Gary brings a passion of multi-stakeholder collaboration and community building capacity in all that he does. So with that, welcome, Gary.
Well, thank you, Julie. Thanks very much. And I'm just going to stare over here to see when the slides are ready. Yeah. So my role in this panel is really quite brief, actually. I'm just really going to set the stage and give the airtime to my colleagues next to me, who I think are going to do a tremendous job. You know, the notion of this webinar was really just to start exploring the relationship between air quality and climate change, at least as it relates to the 2 airsheds. So as air monitoring organizations, thanks. As air monitoring organizations, we really don't touch a lot on climate change in the past. And really the genesis of this was actually a conversation at our board of directors table when we're looking at strategic planning and how do airsheds work with climate change? What is the relationship? So we thought a good opportunity to start exploring. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a couple of sort of really simple definitions, Russ, if you could put those up. You know, I just grabbed a couple of things. I know we all know what climate change and air quality is, but one, if we've got climate change is really talking about long-term shifts in weather, and that's very important when we connect with air quality. And the fact that current climate change is mainly caused by human activities, and it's about the release of greenhouse gases. And that's a Government of Canada definition. The next, I've just grabbed one from the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, and just talking about air quality a little bit. And of course, air quality is affected by the release of air pollutants, but it's also affected a lot by weather. So really, the word weather is a big connection between climate change and air quality as we go. You can click to the next slide. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, so we're really talking about air pollutants and greenhouse gases and how do they relate. So the next slide, I've just put up a really simple graphic that will that some of our communication staff actually put out, really just to say, so we know greenhouse gases, we know what air pollutants are about that affect local respiratory health. And there's a middle, we're having fun with technology, and there's stuff in the middle that's both. Not to say that as an air quality organization, we couldn't play a role in monitoring some of this, and not to say that none of those have any impact on climate change, because they can have secondary impacts, but really those in the middle are really relate to both. So, next slide. And I actually grabbed a really quick graphic from our grade 5 teaching resource. By the way, the two air sheds also do a lot of work at school levels. We have grade 5, grade 9, and grade 12 teaching resources. And you can see here that we have a little equation. So it's air pollution plus weather equals air quality, because weather has such an impact on what the air quality is locally. It can move air pollutants, it can trap air pollutants, it can change air pollutants in atmospheric chemistry, it can do a lot of different things. And if you click one more time, and of course, right now we're dealing with a lot of drying of forests, boreal forests around us, contributing to wildfires, which has an enormous impact on air quality in so many of our communities every year. So my last slide is really just to say a list of how is West Central Airshed Society and Alberta Capital Airshed connected with climate change. So we know that changing weather impacts our monitoring results, and it also and longer term air quality trends. So we need to keep that in mind. That impacts us when we're talking about deploying our monitoring equipment. So we need to consider climate change and what the projections look like. There's an opportunity for collaboration with partners, including academia, but governments and industry and others, to monitor for some of the common pollutants that I showed, or specifically on some of the greenhouse gases that we don't consider air pollutants locally. We know that there will be more frequent and intense wildfires. All the predictions are showing that. It's going to require greater attention for us as air monitoring organizations to work with some of the smaller communities to make sure there's timely public information about the air quality. There's opportunity for some more research and just general awareness about the connection, climate change, drying forests, forest burning, impacting air quality. We have education materials I've mentioned, so we need to make sure that climate change, while mentioned, could be elaborated on further and its relationship with air quality so that younger people can understand the connection. And raise awareness of co-benefits, and I think that's really what today's webinar is. What are the co-benefits to some of the actions that I'm hoping some of my colleagues will touch on, and how might that help? So to lessen contributions toward climate change and improve air quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. All right. So we are now going to go to our first surprise, which is our first award recipient with the Clean Air Award. So a little bit of background. Alberta Capital Airshed wants to recognize the people and the organizations that make a positive difference in the world of air quality. To that end, last year was our first year of hosting the Clean Air Awards. This year is our second annual, award mini ceremony. We have 3 categories. The first one is in raising awareness of air quality. The second one is innovation and application of technology. And the third one is contributions towards community air quality. So in the category of raising awareness of air quality, we'd like to honor Inside Education. So as Alberta's largest environmental and natural resource education charity, Inside Education supports K-12 school teachers across Alberta and inspires students to learn and contribute towards a balanced, sustainable future. In 2015, Inside Education introduced CARS, which aren't really cars. It stands for Clean Air Responsible Schools in the ACA region. And this CARS program brought in informative and fun learning information about air quality to classrooms across the region. Since its inception, CARS, or the Clean Air Responsible Schools, has been an important program for students across Alberta Capital Airshed. So congratulations to Steve McIsaac and Inside Education. Once again, one more round of applause. Our second presenter is Andrew Reed. Andrew Reed is an environmental project engineer with the City of Edmonton. Since graduating from the University of Alberta as a chemical engineer in 2006, where are you? You're right there, okay. He has gained extensive knowledge and experience of Alberta's environmental policies through his past work at Alberta Environment and Parks and the Pembina Institute. Through his career, he has been involved in the development and delivery of a number of environmental initiatives, including the introduction of Alberta's specified gas emitters regulation in 2007, which was the first carbon pricing policy in North America. Very good. As an employee of the City of Edmonton's Environment and Climate Resilience team, Andrew is involved in the implementation of Edmonton's Community Energy Transition Strategy, which I think we may hear a little bit more about, and the quantification and reporting of Edmonton's community and corporate greenhouse gas inventory. So with that, over to you, Andrew.
Fabulous. Thanks for having me, first of all, and thanks everyone that's online and in person. You just jump into the first slide. Probably my first section, I'm going to focus in on air quality very specifically. So this is a bit of a repeat from what Gary was mentioning, but I will just highlight that really we're looking at three different parts of the puzzle in terms of air quality. We have the source of the air pollution, where that pollution is coming from. That is, every one of our vehicles, our industry, and all sorts of sources across the community. The central part, which is really the complicating factor, I would say, is the transportation of those pollutants. So that's where we see how those pollutants are dispersed, making sure that they are not in concentrations that are adverse to health or anything like that, so that when we get to our third piece, the receptors, hopefully we are creating a healthy environment for both the people and the environment there in general. So this is how you can kind of break down the different components of air quality. But I'm going to hone in now on the next slide, please, into some of the dispersion component, which I think is where the complicating factor really arises. And so in Edmonton, there are particular dispersion conditions. Every location has unique conditions that need to be considered when developing, an industrial plant or understanding how roads and those vehicle emissions can contribute to the air quality. But in Edmonton, locally, we have a number of factors that enhance dispersion, and we have some factors that limit dispersion. On the enhanced side, generally Edmonton is rather windy. We don't have mountainous regions that can trap pollutants. There are some challenges that occur with mountains and airflows that trap pollutants. But thankfully we are generally flat and generally windy for most of the time, which create a good dispersion conditions. But that being said, there are factors that limit dispersion. The first one is sort of the regular wintertime temperature inversions. Temperature inversions are a atmospheric condition whereby basically the temperature profile of the atmosphere has been flipped from what it normally would be. Normally you would see temperatures decreasing as you go higher up, but when a temperature inversion occurs, you basically see temperatures lower down than they would be higher up, which has the tendency to trap pollutants at lower zones where people can be exposed to them. So they create stagnation, they create trapping of pollutants that can create health implications. Another aspect of Edmonton that can limit dispersion is any of the local valleys or ravines. Actually, that topography can result in trapped air pollution. Now, typically that's when the sources of those pollutants are down in those ravines. And so really we want to make sure that we're avoiding adding any air pollutants in unique situations like that, where there could be a local trapping of air pollutants within a specific zone. And last but not least, you can create sort of an urban canyon and trap air pollutants in that. And that's caused by tall buildings and air pollution that is generated on those transportation corridors. So along our major transportation corridors with large buildings, you can create this sort of corridor of higher pollution that can be a challenge to deal with. Next one, please. And so that really gets to understanding and communicating when air quality is good and when air quality is bad, so that people can take the appropriate action to protect their personal risk. So there is a lot of onus on an individual to be aware of the air pollution conditions to ensure that they are protected. But we can provide services like those at the airshed to communicate that proactively to the public, so that they are aware of either an upcoming potential temperature inversion, to know that they can refrain from, say, burning their wood stove or something like that to contribute to that problem. But really, awareness really does help for people to choose the right sort of adaptation they want to take on to protect their health. And so I'm just showcasing some of the work that we did in the past here at the City of Edmonton, where we actually took the AQHI from Environment Canada and streamed it onto this Air Quality Health Index light. And so the light actually changes color based on the current Air Quality Health Index ratings, and that can give you a quick visual display of the air quality outside, so that you can be prepared before you open that front door or go out into the street as to what you can expect, and hopefully take the right action so that you feel protected and that you are protected in cases where you might have respiratory illness or anything like that. So next, please, Wes. And so the two, I would say, recurring air quality health events that occur in Edmonton are really associated with both smog and wildfire. Now, both of those are caused by significantly different conditions. In the case of smog, that really is a result from those temperature inversions I had mentioned earlier, where we're seeing trapping of air pollutants within sort of the exposure zone. We're not getting good dispersion conditions, and so you get a buildup of air pollutants that can lead to unsafe levels. And so you can see in this picture here, this is taken from sort of Sherwood Park, looking downtown into Edmonton, and you can just barely make out the city skyline there. And that's really indicative of a smog event that was occurring at that time. The other kind of event, which is usually much more dramatic and much more obvious, is the wildfire events. And so as a wildfire event does occur outside of the city, that air pollution can flow into the city and create a blanket of air pollution within the city that is unhealthy and usually far more dangerous than any other kind of air quality event. And so making sure that people are aware when such an event might happen, looking at our wildfire prediction and making sure people are notified of upcoming events that might come and impact the city is really critical, so that they can, again, take the steps necessary to help protect themselves. And that really then shifts into our next area, which is on the climate change side. So we were talking a lot of air quality, and you can just go right into the next one. But on the climate change side, there's obviously an overlap. Gary's already highlighted those connections to some degree. But when we're looking at climate change on a whole, there's sort of this overarching, I would say, two major baskets of ways of managing and dealing with climate change. And that breaks down to our mitigation and our adaptation approaches. And so mitigation is really about stopping climate change, stopping our contribution to climate change, and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with causing climate change. And that is generally summarized in a lot of our energy transition work, Whereas adaptation is really about reducing the risk from the impacts of climate change, which is actually where a lot more of the air quality consideration of climate change really arises. Is, we're impacted by this wildfire smoke. We're impacted by other air pollution incidences. What do we do about them? How can we make sure that people are safe despite them occurring? In the case that we're maybe unsuccessful or not as successful on our mitigation side, how do we manage those real risks that we're now seeing from the impacts of climate change? Next one, stress. And so over the last few years, Edmonton has developed two distinct sort of strategies dealing with either side of those equations. Edmonton's Community Energy Transition Strategy, which was just updated in 2021, my mistake, lays out the ways that we're going to be dealing with reducing GHGs and reducing our contribution to climate change. And that's where we get into innovations in technology such as electric vehicles, looking at creating higher performance homes so that we're not using as much fossil fuel-based energy in our homes, and reducing that contribution generally. And then Climate Resilient Edmonton really looks at the implications of climate change and what we need to do about that. So that looks at what happens with our rising temperatures. There's more incidences of air pollution that can occur with more heat in the atmosphere. What does that mean for air quality? Does that mean we're going to be seeing more frequent events at different times of the year? But dealing with our rising temperatures, increased flooding risk with overland and river flooding, changing extreme temperatures, changing extreme weather. So how we can expect that those implications will affect the city, and what we can do about mitigating those impacts so that we're prepared and ready to adapt to any of these implications that do arise. Next one, please. Yeah. And so then that begs the question, how does climate change affect air quality? Well, thankfully, and I'm completely reliant on this great assessment that Health Canada recently did, Health in a Changing Climate, which provides a really, I would say, accessible forum of information about how climate change will impact a number of different components, including air quality. So topics cover, Indigenous health, natural hazards, infectious diseases, health equity, across the board. But one of the key parts is sort of the air quality component. And just on to the next one, they've put together sort of a very, I would say, a good snapshot of a quick understanding of how climate change can have implications for air quality. So starting with our emissions components and how the emissions of both air pollutant and GHGs have climate change forces. Some of those are positive, some of those are negative, and how those balance is an outstanding question generally. But those climate change forces then have implications for our temperatures, the precipitation, the seasonal patterns, and extreme weather. And so each of those then needs to be considered, and how does that change? What does that mean for the air quality component? And I would say that this is an area that's ripe for further study. There's a lot of nuance and uncertainty within that realm is ripe for further research. But it does require complex climate modeling to sort out all of these complex interactions of the atmosphere. And so next one. So what is the city really doing about it? I'm going to start at the highest level, which is Edmonton's strategic plan, Connect Edmonton, which really details a strategic plan from 2019 to 2028, but it's setting out a direction for the future. We're looking at a vision for Edmonton in 2050. What do we do with population growth? How do we become more efficient in how we do things? But through that work and that overarching strategic plan, there are 4 key goals of the strategy here. And those being healthy city, urban places, regional prosperity, and climate resilience. And I would say that air quality and climate change can easily fit within 2 of these, maybe even 3, quite safely. And so healthy city has a key component of providing a healthy environment for people to exist in. And obviously climate resilience is looking at that, what are the implications of climate moving forward Next one, please. And then drilling down to that, there's our city plan. So that really leverages that Connect Edmonton strategy and looks at how to deliver and meet those climate change, or so that those overarching goals. So this is really just the next step down in terms of the planning process. But through that, we've got some key goals in there where there is an objective to ensure that Edmonton's air, land, and water are safe and clean. And that looks at leveraging our partnerships, like with the Alberta Capital Airshed, and make sure that people have the resources and knowledge available, that they understand the air, land, and water implications, so that they can take the right steps to protect themselves and can be proactive as well. And then last but not least, again, drilling down another layer, this is kind of the planning process at its finest here. We have the district planning effort. And so this is really a multi-year project to look at how to create the city plan's 15-minute district. So creating a livable sort of small towns within a big city. And so you have the map here that kind of breaks down the city into these unique districts that will have particular public engagement guided towards them. The public engagement is open right now. So if you are interested, by all means, take a look at the City of Edmonton website on our district planning, and there's some engagement opportunities available right now. But this is where we really drive down into, what can be done in each of these districts. And, ultimately, I think there's an open question to the public is what would you like to see in your district around air quality, and how that can be enabled through the work of the district planning. And so I'll just leave you with that and hand it over to Dave. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. Wonderful, thank you, Andrew. I like how you ended off with that question. We can really kind of start to imagine, what do we want in our districts as it relates to air quality? Okay, so we will be now handing out our second Clean Air Award in the category of Innovation and Application of Technology. So Dr. Zhao, Assistant Professor of Chemistry, University of Alberta, is an enthusiastic atmospheric chemist who leads a group of students in research to better understand the role of chemistry in the air that we breathe indoors and outdoors. This work has included the assembling of self-made indoor air monitoring sensors and installing them adjacent to Alberta Capital Airshed outdoor sensors to better understand the change in air quality as we go indoors and outdoors. So congratulations, Ran. All right, on to our last presenter of the webinar. David Dodge is the producer and host of the greenenergyfutures.ca multimedia series. He has spent a decade researching energy, clean energy, and energy transition. He has produced more than 300 video, radio, and blog stories on leading clean energy technologies, projects, and leaders in Canada. David has served as the founding chair of the Board of Energy Efficiency Alberta and co-chair of Edmonton's Energy Transition Advisory Committee, which I understand led to some of the work that Andrew was just talking about. David is a sought-after public speaker. Thank you for coming today. And has delivered more than 150 talks and keynote addresses on energy transition. David has examined solar, wind, geothermal, biogas, biomass, biodiesel, and landfill gas, and industrial symbiosis, and many other clean technologies. He has researched net zero buildings, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and mode shift through urban design, and is a regular speaker at conferences, events, and in the media. So with that, over to you, David.
So happy to be here, and I have to say, when I was first approached to do this, I said I know nothing about air quality. You understand that, right? I know nothing about air quality, but I think I know about things that can affect air quality. And so if I can do one thing today, I hope I surprise you. And I surprise you about the potential, the opportunity to look at air quality, to change air quality for the better through my presentation. And if I've achieved that, please let me know when we're done. My first engagement with air quality was as a very young reporter. I think it was almost still in university at the time. I was working for the St. Albert Gazette. And the Lodgepole well blew up, spewing what do you call it, sour gas all over Canada, basically, but mostly over Alberta. And I got to go out with Alberta Environment, who had just created their first motorhome monitoring station, just like the ones you guys have in the back here. They had a motorhome and they went out and followed the plume around. So I had the enviable task of going with them and following the plume of the electrical blowout, which was stinky, to say the least. So I hope what I do today is very pleasantly surprised. You get your thought process going about potential. We may not know the impacts of climate change on air quality, as Andrew was alluding. You know, it could be good, could be bad, but I'm telling you, the solutions to climate change are so aligned with air quality, it's just ridiculous. So let's get into this. If I can show my first or second slide now, I guess we have no slides.
People on the call can see them, but
Oh, okay. So I'll just keep going.
yeah.
So, I titled this "Climate Changes Everything." I thought that was almost clever. Let's go to the second slide. So energy transitions here, you know, people in Alberta may not be aware of this, at least not to the extent of it. And you know, you hear mixed opinion. Some people are worried about its impact on our conventional industries. Other people are, you just hear mixed messages about it all the time. I'm here to tell you it's here and it's in play in a major, major way that we haven't been paying attention to. And we're talking about a revolution, not an evolution. And I hope you'll be convinced of that by the time I'm done. Investment has already moved for many of the key things in the energy industry and in a lot of other sectors. And I'm going to go into the details of that. It'll change how you live, how you work, and how you play, and how you get around. The really big changes that are going to come are on all the foundational things in society. So energy, transportation, and buildings. And those are the three big sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So let's get into it. Let's try Russ. Let's try you doing it and see if I can. I always like to start with this slide because I love this because it's such a change for me. When I started covering this stuff 10 years ago, solar reporters didn't even know how to write about solar. They didn't even understand it. And now it's a major industry. And so this represents the change I'm talking about. The former governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, I love this. He says, the transition to net zero emissions is the greatest commercial opportunity of our age. And what he's saying is this transition is so big and the work we need to do it is an unbelievable opportunity. And I'll get more into the value of that opportunity in a second. The other one is Brian Basso, the CEO of Capital Power. Who would have thought a coal company, a very prominent coal company in Alberta, would buy in to the government's idea of accelerating the coal phase out in Alberta, 2015-ish, I think it was. Yeah, they were a bit mad at the time. They were worried about stranded assets. They and the other coal companies fought a little bit with the Alberta government. I'm telling you, they got over that. And now their business plans are completely changed. And Capital Power is the last to phase out their coal, but it's going to happen 7 years ahead of schedule. This is one of the largest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in Canadian history. And I'm forgetting the number, but I think it was about 20 megatons in one action, which is absolutely stunning. Let's go to the next slide. So as I said, it's in three big boxes: energy. So let's go to the next slide. The first box is energy. We now know, thanks again to work that was done in Alberta around the same time, 2015, that renewable energy is the cheapest. It's the cheapest by far anywhere in the world. It's the cheapest way to produce a new electricity, new energy in the world. Next slide, please. And so here's the really exciting thing. I used to show this slide 2 or 3 years ago, and I would say, Bloomberg is saying there's going to be $13.3 trillion investment in new power generation between now and 2050. And 80% of that, or 77%, is going to be in renewable energy. Well, that's been revised already just 3 years later. It's now they're saying more than $100 trillion will be invested in those energy sources between now and 2050. Because they're expecting our response to climate change to double the demand for electricity. And so that's pretty crazy. The other thing that surprises me, if you click once, I think it'll draw a circle. Yeah. What surprises me, and this is a big change, is I thought it was going to be mostly wind. If you'd asked me this 5 or 6 years ago, but solar is just rocketing worldwide. And I think it's because it works at small scale on your house and giant scale. The largest solar project in Canadian history is now being built in Alberta, and it's the largest by a factor of 3. It's just massive. And so what they're predicting now is that the future energy mix, which you see on the right there, will be solar is going to play a big role, and wind power and hydro. You're not going to see a lot of new hydro simply because it just takes a long time to develop them. You got to find a place you can flood where people won't be mad. And it's just kind of complicated to make new hydro projects. Next slide, please. So right now, and you don't hear about this, and I guess this is why I exist to do green energy futures, is we're in the middle of a solar and wind power boom. It's crazy what's happening out there. There is so much development going on. It's interesting because just a couple of years ago, most of the solar in Alberta was small solar systems. So Albertans have embraced this. There's about 7,000 small solar systems in Alberta, and most of the capacity in Alberta up until a couple of years ago was those small home systems on homes and businesses. Now it's happening at utility scale in a really, really big way. The largest project I just mentioned is the Traverse project. I think it's near Vulcan, Alberta. It's 465 megawatts. What's really cool about this investment, so if you want to talk about solving climate change as an investment, a place for investment, that project is, I think it's $700 million itself. But Amazon has purchased 80% of that electricity, and they haven't even started producing electrons. So they've already pre-sold all that clean electricity to one of the world's biggest companies right here in Alberta. The reason is this is the only place you can do this in Canada. It's almost true. And all of this kind of development is happening in Alberta right now simply because our regulatory environment allows it. And so you can go out and say, I have $700 million. I want to build Canada's biggest solar farm, and you can just do it. And really, the only thing holding you back is finding someone to pay for the power. And apparently, that's not very hard right now. Let's go to the next slide. So this is Alberta in 1991. 80% coal, most of the rest natural gas, a little bit of hydro, teeny slice of wind. We were just beginning to discover that wind power might be a thing. Now flip it. So this is 2022. Coal's virtually gone. The only coal plant left is Genesee, and it'll be gone by next year. It's been retrofitted for really high efficiency gas. And so coal's essentially gone. It's been replaced mostly by natural gas. Now I can hear some people say, oh, okay, but natural gas still has emissions. Aren't we embedding ourselves into a future where we're locking into a bunch of other emissions? True, except a lot of those facilities are midlife already. So there's lots of flexibility in what happens in the future. Next slide, please. And this slide I took out of Capital Power's annual report, their actual presentation on their annual report. This is not their projection. They're cleverly included this because this is the United States projections, but it also seems to work for Alberta. So if you get to where we are right now, you can see I drew the arrow down saying coal's gone. And so what's the future going to be? Well, it looks like it's going to be renewables and natural gas. And natural gas will go down over time. This is not for Alberta, this graph, remember, it's just a trend. And renewables will go up. And I think that's how Capital Power sees it, although they don't know yet either, because they're betting on a number of different solutions in the future. They don't know how this is all going to turn out. Nobody does. Next slide, please.
And just one sec, before you advance, they're not showing up here.
Oh.
It's on the other one, though.
So
But
the
it's
audience can
online.
see it, right?
You can keep going
You guys
online.
can't. Sorry to
Okay.
you guys in the room. I can see it. It looks great. So let's just go to the next slide and I'll keep going while you figure that out. Next slide, please. So the next big box is transportation, where we get emissions from. This is done already. It's finished. The entire auto industry has moved virtually all of their investment, which 2 years ago was called $300 billion, has been updated in the last year. It's now $515 billion in new investment in electric vehicles. There are somewhere between 400 and 700 models of electric vehicles under development, even though right here in Edmonton, you might go out there and it's hard to spot a Tesla still, or a Leaf or some other electric car. It's going to happen fast. And I find it interesting because the surveys back this up too. People's intentions about electric cars are actually going up pretty quick, even though we don't have a lot of experience in places like Alberta with this stuff. So this is really big. The car industry had to pick a winner, and they picked electric. Yes, there's still some hydrogen, Toyota's involved, there's a few other places involved, but the small vehicle market looks like it's going to be 100% electric. And so let's go to the next slide, please. This all started thanks to Tesla. Let's go to the next slide. Amazon jumped on this a couple of years ago. They ordered so many electric delivery vans. These are already on the street in places like Vancouver and Seattle that they wound up buying part of Rivian, the electric car company. So they had such a big order, they thought we should just buy the company. So they did. Next slide, please. In China, they also want to own this space. And so they've really been putting a lot of energy into this. You might hear about China in a negative light, but they're also leading the renewable energy revolution in the world right now because they want to sell us everything. And so this is Shenzhen, sorry. This is a city the size of New York in southern China. They decided, well, we want to learn how to make buses in volume. We want to learn how to charge them. We want to get this right. So they outfitted the entire city, 16,000 electric buses in about 2 to 3 years. So they took New York, transformed it to electric in 2 to 3 years. And the whole idea for them is to learn how to manufacture and eventually sell us all of their technology. But in the meantime, it's a pretty good solution for themselves as well. Next slide, please. There's a lot of things conspiring for this change. And that's why I'm so optimistic about it. It's not just people who care about the environment. It's not just companies seeing new investments. There's regulatory and government action behind this as well. So there's a whole bunch of cities and states that are already planning to ban gas vehicles, diesel vehicles. This is Copenhagen, one of the most aggressive. They're actually trying to be net zero, I think by 2025 or something. I'm not quite sure how they'll do that quick, but they're planning on banning diesel vehicles in 2025 and gas by 2030 within the city limits of Copenhagen. That kind of stuff is happening all around the world. And now we're seeing the numbers behind that, people purchasing electric vehicles, that sort of stuff, really pick up. In the UK, Norway was just ridiculous. The numbers, I think at the end of the year, I think there were 80% EV sales by the end of the year. Next slide, please. The third category is a bit harder. It's buildings, because nobody really tracks this. And I can't just come and say, well, here's where all the investment's going, because nobody really tracks it. But buildings are huge when it comes to emissions. Buildings are important to us. We live in them, we work in them. This is where we experience air quality and everything else. And so the happy thing is there are really good solutions. We can live in way better homes and work in way better buildings in the future. And ironically, right here in Edmonton, we help pioneer how to do this. So we have some of the best super efficient building and home builders in all of Canada. Peter Amarungan is a local builder who's often called the father of net zero in Canada because he started doing it so early. This is a landmark home, and this was already many years ago. This is the cheapest net zero home you could buy in all of Canada, $399,000, including GST. And again, this was a number of years ago. We have the expertise to do new. The big challenge is, what do you do with those 80% of buildings that are already built and will still be standing in 2050 as inefficient buildings? Next slide, please. I have a follow-up on that, but just before that, this is a company in Guelph, Ontario. So there is momentum among the builders. So 5 or 6 years ago, I would have characterized the builders that are interested in building net zero as niche. Now, completely changing. And again, it's ahead of the regulatory system because these guys have suddenly decided if we want to have a future, we need to get this right. We need to make it affordable and we need to make it available now. This is a typical builder in Guelph, Ontario, Terra View Homes, who was like 30, 40 years in business building typical custom homes in the suburbs, just like many home builders in Alberta. And they decided they were going to go totally net zero. I think this was 2 years ago. So all they build now is net zero. They're even working on multifamily, which is what you see in the picture there. And guess what? The market in Guelph is ready for it. So the market understands the value proposition of buying a home that doesn't produce any emissions, doesn't cost a lot to heat and to provide electricity to. And so they're already selling like crazy in a market. So this means this is going to change pretty quick. Next slide, please. Simons. I got to meet Peter Simon. That was so cool. This is the oldest retailer in Canada. It came out of Quebec, maybe except the Hudson's Bay Company. Came out of Quebec. And the first Simon store, not in Quebec, was in Edmonton, at West Edmonton Mall. The first city to get a second Simon store outside of Quebec was Edmonton. And this is, that's not in the picture here, but it was Londonderry Mall in North Edmonton. And why is the Simons at Londonderry Mall? You should ask, is that their market? You know, is that the right, that's my neighborhood. Is that the right neighborhood for a Simons? Well, I think they probably saved the mall, first of all, because they're an amazingly talented retailer. But the reason they located there is because the mall would work with them to put a giant solar system on the roof. And so it's 50% powered by renewable energy, Simons at Londonderry Mall. But the owner and founder, the fifth generation owner of this company, told me himself, standing in the parking lot, he couldn't resist. You couldn't just stay with the story. You know, you're not supposed to tell me about the next story when you're in the middle of getting me all excited about this story. But he couldn't help himself. He said, you know, we're already building the first net zero department store in all of Canada. And they did, it's in Quebec. So now we proved we can do this at a mass scale, uses geothermal and solar. Next slide, please. Edmonton, people don't talk about this enough, and maybe it was too visionary too early, but Blatchford is the largest planned carbon neutral community in North America and maybe the world. 30,000 people will live there. They have a green building code. They have a district geothermal system, and one click, that's my house. Finally under construction. I bought it in 2019. Next slide, please. So green buildings, what's the opportunity here? I talked about this before. We're not tracking this. Let's say we take climate change seriously. We appear to be taking it seriously. Let's say we're going to address buildings up to a third of the problem. What do we do with all those old buildings? Well, there's Peter Amarongen, the visionary builder that I told you about before. He's actually doing an amazing pilot right here at the Sundance Housing Co-op in Edmonton. He's renovating 69 units, 69 homes to net zero, all in one project. And the idea is stolen from Netherlands. They invented this idea of energy sprong, and energy sprong means energy leap. And what Netherlands has done to address this issue is they made it a national priority to renovate every building in the country to net zero. So they started, they're doing 15,000 of them right now. And their idea is to industrialize the process, the financing, and make this irresistible. So you can do this out of the energy savings easily in Netherlands. And so they scan the house with LiDAR and lasers, and they build a whole new facade for a house or a building in a factory. And then they land it on the building. We're using cranes, and in the space of a week, you go from an old 1953 semi-bungalow to a net zero home. And so it's people thinking like that about how we address this big problem in the long run. So what does this look like? Well, how much of this problem will we address? I don't know. Maybe you know, maybe you have some guesses. Well, how big is the problem? Well, the challenge in Canada is 9 million homes and about 480,000 commercial buildings. So think about this as economic opportunity. How many plumbers, electricians, framers, et cetera, will it take to do $1 trillion worth of renovations that could theoretically pay for themselves out of the savings? I don't know, but I find that kind of exciting as a commercial opportunity if we're actually taking solving climate change seriously. Next slide, please. I just wanted to stop here for a second. These are 3 different packages of statistics all in one slide, just to show you that there's 10,000 ways to look at the emissions of climate change. So the top there in writing is how Edmonton looks at it. So Edmonton has their energy transition plan that Andrew referred to, and it says we're about a third. We're, you know, a third industrial emissions, a third buildings, a third transportation. So that's how they look at the challenge. It really depends on how you package this. I forget whose graph that is in the bottom right, but you can see this is by sector. So oil and gas, electricity, et cetera. The one on the left is by method of consuming energy. And so these are all the same thing, but they appear to be different. So don't be confused when you see this stuff. All I want to show you is what are the impacts of our solutions and which will benefit the most. So let's look at the graph on the right so let's say we electrify all the cars. So we've eliminated a huge chunk of that transportation slice at the bottom. You know, there's some big commercial stuff that has to be dealt with, et cetera, et cetera. That takes a big chunk out of the oil and gas one. That adds a chunk to the electricity one. So the new electricity needs to be clean. Each of these things are interdependent. And so talk about energy. energy is the root director. So if you have 100% renewable energy worldwide for your electricity, then all those electric cars, Bob's your uncle. They're great. There's no emissions. So all of these things are intersected. And I think if I have a message for people who care about air quality is to think about it this way and think about it strategically. So air quality monitoring, in my very simplistic view, you can go out and you can measure the impact, like I did with Lodgepole's blowout a long time ago. And then you try to be proactive after that. How do I fix that problem? Or you can be proactive in the first place and then measure to see if you're making progress. Well, I think this is your opportunity to be very proactive, because you can look at these directions where investment is already loading up and we're already going that are crazy different, revolution, not evolution. And you can probably want to have some input into that to maximize your air quality outputs or however you refer to your goals. Next slide, please. I wanted to end with one thing. This is not something I talked much about, but I've been looking into it recently. There is another climate solution. Most climate plans have a black box in them. So they do all the EVs, they make the buildings efficient, they get renewable energy, they remove the emissions from their gas heated stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's still a black hole left of what do we do with the last 17% or 20% of emissions? Edmonton's plan has that. They have a black hole and they just label it CCS and nature storage. Now, they only have a vague idea of how this is going to happen, how they're going to solve that. And Edmonton has a goal of 2 million trees. That's going to make a big difference, although they're not quite sure how much difference yet. But I'm saying this is a really big box. And if I had a choice between investing in taking a bunch of carbon and locking it under the ground, which seems like an exercise of, what's the output of that? You're just burying CO2. What if you could create beautiful cities? What if you could regenerate forests, stop deforestation in places? What a better place, what a great place to spend money, because we could wind up with better cities. You guys already know the benefits of trees and natural ecosystems. And the more natural, the better, by the way. I haven't looked into this a lot, but when we just go plant a few shrubs out in the boulevard, that helps, but not nearly as much as going to one of those stormwater ponds that you see in the city and recreating a wetland ecosystem instead of just planting them. Huge benefits. And we got a beautiful place where there's going to be birds you can go watch and more help with clean air. Next slide, please. So they're saying, various proponents are saying that natural carbon solution or nature carbon solution can be a fairly significant piece of the puzzle. And that's what that green part is there. Next slide, please. So I think I'm at the end here. There are many co-benefits. I already said I don't know anything about them, so I'll leave it to you guys to tell me what they are. And which of these strategies will work best to achieve your outcomes. This is my token slide. Next, please. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I love how you ended that there on the token slide. And just on another note, it was really interesting how I didn't realize that how a significant moment at the beginning of your journey was Lodgepole, which actually was the event that spurred West Central Airship Society into existence. So that's interesting because now, this
and
event
the founding of the Pembina Institute.
There you go. Yeah, so quite the event. Yeah. And on a side note, when Peter Amarangan's all done with Sundance, he'll be coming over to my house. So we'll see how that net zero project works out, retrofitting my 1950s bungalow. Some of the questions I have, when we talk about air quality and climate change, what kind of filters do we need to make sure that air quality that's coming in is good, even in the case of a wildfire event. When we have a wildfire event, how's that going to impact the efficacy of my solar panels? All of that. So I'm curious to hear more perhaps. Okay, before we get to questions from attendees, we have one last Clean Air Award to give. In the category of contributions towards community air quality, we would like to acknowledge Dr. Greg King. Dr. Greg King is an associate professor in environmental studies at the University of Alberta, Augustana campus. Greg led a group of fourth-year students in a research project to map out ambient air quality in the city of Camrose, and Camrose is part of that Alberta Capital Airshed region. And they did this through the use of wearable monitors that captured information on particulates, NO2, and VOCs. The student group actually presented in one of our previous Clean Air webinars, and you can view that recording on our website. It was a really fun webinar. I really do hope that you go and look at it. It was really cool, some of the things that they were able to discover with these wearable devices. Okay, so congratulations to Dr. Greg King. So I did notice that we did get a couple of questions into the Q&A. I realized that we're getting very close to the end of time, so we'll maybe take about 4 or 5 questions and then we'll wrap it up. So one is from the Q&A on the webinar about the AQHI lights. So that was something that Andrew had mentioned. Andrew, where can we find those around the city of Edmonton? And then I'm going to give a plug for one people can maybe find right here today.
Right. So right now, unfortunately, at the onset of the pandemic, we kind of just boxed it, for lack of a better term. So it hasn't been out in the community for a couple of years now. We don't have plans to get it out there right away, which we're obviously working through other items in terms of recovery, but hopefully sooner rather than later. But the script that was created to develop that is actually publicly available. So if you go through to our, I think a Smart Cities website on the City of Edmonton, would likely take you to the script that you need to. And so I do know that I think up in Peace River and Bonnyville, others have picked up that script and are running with it as well. So the city's light, unfortunately, is in my office right now, but there are others out there, and yeah, once we get a bit more close to full recovery kind of thing, then we'll be thinking about plans to get ours out there too. So
Perfect. Thanks, Gary. Anything to add?
We have one on the main floor of this building actually running, and it's a slightly different, it's had more off-the-shelf technology that the bulb changes color, but you can link it to the AQHI, so you'll see it on the main floor.
Good. And where would people find our building, or how would they come and see it if they wanted to?
Well, I would give them the address, like the 8737 53rd Avenue.
Perfect. Okay, so anybody who wants to come see it at some point, you can send us an email. We'll make sure you can come look at it. Okay, the next one is there any movement in changing building codes to ensure that home building and heating is from renewable energy as the primary source of energy and the use of natural gas as a plan B option? So I think we'll go to David first for that one.
I don't know about energy, but there's certainly movement to improve the building code to go to net zero ready. So that's the talk that goes up and down the discussions, but perhaps as early as 2030, which would definitely affect the energy outcome anyways, because if you're building a net zero home, part of the definition is you're providing your own renewable energy on the house. Something you mentioned before too about your new home and about these new homes require air control because they're so tight. You need mechanized air systems to bring fresh air into the home. And the happy coincidence is these things are really cool. They're called ERVs or HRVs, and you can put HEPA filters and all kinds of different filters in them. You can actually wind up with more fresh air and less of the fire smoke.
That's what I'm hoping for. So those are the questions that I'm asking. Yeah.
maybe I can
Go ahead.
elaborate on. I'm not an expert on the building code, but I do work with a number of the city's folks on building code. And my understanding of the arrangement of the building code is that it is really on the envelope performance and that component rather than the energy source. So most of the building code is around how much energy should be provided to maintain the systems there, not where that energy is coming from. Not to say that building codes could change to adapt that, but that's just not how they're structured right now, where there's been a lack of sort of prescription in the source of the energy ultimately. So, but it does get to the envelope and how much energy you do use, which is half the battle in terms of getting down to your emissions control.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for that. Another question we had is whether or not the presentations from all of our panelists will be available afterwards. Yes, we will be sending that out in an email to anybody who registered. Other folks who might want to view them later, whatever, they can email us. The recording will be posted to the website though, following this this day. Okay, another question we have is around strategies for managing wildfire smoke, which includes the use of AC and filters that can consume a lot of energy. So how does that jive with reduction of energy initiatives for climate change reasons? So there's this tension here. Who wants to take that one first?
I can maybe start, but yeah, there is an inherent tension in terms of adaptation and mitigation when it comes down to energy use in particular. But in general, right now, we have energy sources that are close to non-emitting that we can rely on to supply that energy. So it is a balancing act. I will absolutely admit it. And sometimes I'm up late at night, trying to figure out where exactly we're on that tipping point. But it is really important to understand that there is going to be a continued need for energy in some form. There's things that we need energy for to have a prosperous life like we have right now. And so how do we supply the energy properly so that it is, as low of impact as possible, I think is really the key. But it's a balancing act. Like I say, I feel like some days that I'm walking a tightrope between our, we know that there's new impacts coming. We know that, a weather event in and of itself can have huge implications, maybe not on the energy, but on disruption to personal lives and stuff. And we want to make sure that that disruption is as little as possible as well. And so, getting the balance right, I think, is the key. And where the city kind of lands on that is making sure that we have the best evidence, scientific evidence and information available to advise on what the right steps are forward, which is a daunting task, but one that we'll take on wholeheartedly.
Right, for sure. I'm sorry to hear it's keeping you up at night. I guess at some level it's keeping all of us up at night, right? What are we gonna do? Okay, so we've got one last question here on the webinar side of things that I think we'll take, and then we'll start to wrap it up, which is more on that nature-based solutions pathway that you identified, David, in your slides. So the question here is a bit more on the value of nature-based solutions and the role of the river valley in rewilding tablelands, etc. So it seems to me as we densify, we also need to intensify our reverence for nature. And I'm going to tag on a little piece to that too. When I think it was you were talking, Andrew, about the weather inversions and the trapping of pollution in our ravines and valleys. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm in sort of this clean air desert. If I want to go for a walk where I live, sometimes there's construction, there's traffic and all of this, and I feel like I can't really get some good fresh air. So then I go into the river valley and it feels cleaner to me, but then I'm also hearing about these inversions that happen. So a little bit about the nature-based solutions piece and rewilding, and a little bit about the inversions and that, again, conflict between trapping of pollution and maybe getting some reprieve from this clean air desert that I sometimes feel outside of the ravine.
Right. So I guess first thing is, thankfully we have very, very, very few emission sources in ravines and low-lying areas. So thankfully, in general, you are correct that you are actually probably getting some of the cleaner air within a city that you can get in those parks. But we know of from work that ACA has done that there are point sources that are problematic in those low areas. But I guess thinking more broadly in terms of how we leverage nature to provide clean air and things like that, I'm definitely interested in how we bring more information from the network that Capital Airshed has on air quality in our district planning work to understand, are there things we can do in terms of simply where we plant trees that can actually create that refuge of clean air in most events. Now, obviously, you're still outside, you're probably not going to be able to trap, stop forest fire smoke coming in and creating a clean air shelter. You probably need to make a structure for that. And so in that regard, we do have some efforts underway in terms of creating these sort of clean air shelters or what's termed like a climate resilience hub, where you can take refuge from either extreme weather or it's wildfire smoke and you don't have good filtration in your house, you can take refuge there. So there's sort of I guess, a way that we can start to define what we are going to need to maintain a healthy environment, whether that's, out in outside air and making sure that we have the right open spaces and we have the right features that maintain sort of good air quality from roadways and things like that. But then going beyond that, what do we do in those extreme cases where there really is nothing that you can do other than to shelter in place, for lack of a better term? And that's really, that's when we're in that emergency response sort of situation. So, but all of those need to be considered, I think, in terms of these district plans and what we need to be seeing in terms of the deployment of our natural infrastructure throughout the city.
Yeah, thanks for that. What else would you add there, David?
I would just say the city is also doing some really interesting work related to climate change, related to biodiversity, on mapping out all the different ecotypes in the city, whether they're boulevard trees, or whether they're the stormwater areas, or wetlands, or forested areas, or reforested areas, river valley. They're actually mapping out all these things, and they're trying to quantify the benefits in terms of ecosystem services and in terms of the ability to store carbon, which is one of the key things they're looking at. And I think the happy thing here, the person who asked the question asked about reverence for nature. I think the happy coincidence here is in my cursory look at this, and I really want to look deeper in it because a lot of people are curious about this, is that the closer to nature you get, the better the system for the outcomes, and especially in terms of carbon storage. So saving a wetland and restoring a wetland is really important. Really important. It also happens to be important for a whole bunch of other reasons, for waterfowl, wildlife, whatever else happens, quality of life, our appreciation of nature. So I think there is a connection there. They are doing some work on it, and I think we'll be led down a path that'll make a more beautiful, livable city.
Yeah, perfect. So what advice would, and I'm going to give this to each of the three of you as sort of our last little question here, which dovetails off of this conversation about the rewilding. If, say, somebody was going to be redoing their yard, right? And they were to plant some plants and try and be intentional about what they can do to help mitigate, against climate change, or help be resilient for the adaptation, while also, creating a healthier air pocket within their community. Sort of what things would you want them to consider, or places where you'd want them to go for further advice to sort of try and research all of those pieces? So let's go to Gary first.
Okay, top of mind, drought resistant, so you don't probably not grass. If you do have something you're going to use equipment with, not gas powered. So push mowers, if necessary, electric is great, but get away from this, particularly the 2-stroke engines for air pollution reasons. Trees are wonderful for providing natural air conditioning and other things, as well as being filters of air pollutants. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, stole all my answers. but no, I mean, I'll just really, I guess, lean on the shading that is created by trees and foliage and things like that. And I think people really underestimate the implication that can have on your building design and creating, as you say, natural air conditioning. I live pretty close to here, just off of Argyle, and our front has extensive large boulevard trees, but the back is effectively backing onto Argyle, which is pretty much devoid of trees for the most part. And so my backyard is really hot, and if we didn't have my one apple tree, it would be almost impossible to be back there in the summer, especially if we get heat waves like last year. And so it's thinking about where you place. If you are going to plant a tree, think about drought resistant, think about a tree that naturally does exist in Edmonton. Think about the change, increasing temperatures and things like that in terms of what would be a resilient tree going forward. But also think about the simple placement of where that tree goes to provide additional, if it's energy savings because it's shading your house, or it's just creating an area that you can take advantage of. Both of those, I think, are really important so that you have that space that you use.
Perfect, thanks.
I have 2 quick things. The first home I bought had a large west-facing front window and no operable windows in that half of the floor. And so on a summer day, when it was 30, it was probably 40. in the living room. We literally couldn't use that half of the house in the heat of the summer. We planted a tree. It was a broadleaf tree, and you really can't underestimate trees as air conditioners. It sounds trite, but they are the best. So once this tree became mature, we could survive. I must admit, I wasn't there for the heat dome, but we could survive 30 degrees pretty easy in our living room because it really kept it a lot cooler. And the really happy thing is the leaves fall off in the winter, and you get that solar gain and that solar heat in the wintertime when you actually want it. I'll end with one other thing. I met a lady in the North End. She's actually a school teacher. Her name's Darcy Christian. And she's thought about this stuff a lot. So what she did was she xeriscaped her front yard, the whole yard. So there's nothing that requires watering, and it's all native species. But she also did one other thing. She planted a garden, and she collects rainwater. The only thing she uses the rainwater for is her vegetable. So she's growing local food, and she's got the naturalized landscape, which is like 2 bags for the So anyways.
Perfect. I love it. So I want to say thank you to you, all 3 of you, for coming, preparing these presentations, giving us so much food for thought around that connection between air quality and climate change. Very much appreciate that. And before we close out today, I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of folks working behind the scenes to put this on. So you may have seen Russ right over here doing all the technical support for the webinar. Serena Tang, who is likely posting some things on social media as we have been doing this webinar. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and LinkedIn. So if you are using any of those, I highly encourage you to give us a little follow. And I'd also like to give a little shout out to all of the other airsheds and member organizations that have been sharing information about the Clean Air Webinar Series, helping to get the word out there that clean air matters and that, monitoring the air quality matters so we can understand what's happening. So with that, thank you for helping us understand this overlap in the Venn diagram between climate change and air quality. And that's a wrap. Thank you very much.